Hi everyone, great to have the opportunity to talk to you today. My name's Sam Klein. I am a Principal Data Strategist at AWS. Interesting, we'll come back to that title as I go through my presentation because there's an interesting story around that. But today I want to talk to you about creating business value at scale using Gen AI. The welcome to country's already been done, so thank you Cassidy. I'll skip through that. So I want to talk to you about generative AI and not just the hype and not just those really exciting things to do, but I want to use some of this opportunity to talk a little bit about, well, what is it? So let's level set on what generative AI is and why has it gone so gangbusters over the last 18 months. I want to talk about how technology evolutions in the past have come through and some of the lessons we're learning from some of those things when they go mainstream. And so then I want to apply some of those lessons to generative AI. And I think there's some really interesting lessons as we go through some of those stories about, well, what does that mean for us as leaders now, as we're coaching our teams and our organizations and our customers through the art of the possible with generative AI. So the seeds for generative AI have been sown for many decades, and we're now at the time where we can start to leverage that capability, but that has come from initially that massive proliferation of data, and data of all different shapes and sizes. The availability of scalable compute has meant we're able to collect and use that data in ways we've never been able to do. And obviously the advances in machine learning and the accessibility of that capability over the last 2 years in particular has meant that it's much more accessible to customers, to organizations of all shapes and sizes. So the seeds of these things have been sown for a long time. For example, a really simple example, but it's worth talking about, right? Just to really level set. So take a small sentence fragment and then start to poll the room about, well, what would the next word be? Most people would say, well, it's one small step for man because it's a pretty well-known quote. If you continue to play out that sentence, you'll see that it starts to build out based on, the probability distribution of people and knowing what that next word would be to form that full sentence, if you like. So one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It's a pretty simplistic example, but it's a good one to talk about. So if we talk about generative AI, let's go back a little bit and talk about, well, how does that fit in with AI and ML and all these terms that we probably use a little bit interchangeably. So let's talk about how they build up. So artificial intelligence, been around for many, many decades, but that technique to go, how do I mimic human logic, if then else, how do I mimic that with machines? The next part of that stack, or the subset of artificial intelligence, is what we call machine learning. So using massive amounts of data to look for patterns to then determine outcomes, so predict what an outcome is. A subset of machine learning is deep learning, where it uses neural networks to form relationships and form patterns and understand more complex data, but again, to then be able to predict outcomes. And then if we talk about generative AI, again, it's a subset of deep learning. So we're going down the stack here. It's a subset of deep learning that also talks about or uses foundational models, large language models, to then determine new content and new generation, not just a prediction score, it's what's next out of that. Another way to think about these concepts is to think about the complexity of the inputs that go into those models, and then the types of outputs that come out of that as well. So with machine learning, like we talked about, massive amounts of data and looking for patterns in that data to then be able to predict a particular thing, like a house value based on square meterage and postcode, as an example. So deep learning, the next part of that stack, talks then about using those neural networks to look for relationships between all these types of data, and not just structured data, but different types of data. Again, to get a predictable output. And generative AI, again, takes many of those different types of complex data, but then the output is different. It creates many different types of outputs, right? It generates many different types of outputs, whether that's an image, whether that's a sentence like we talked about as that simple instruction, or whether it's a blog post or a conversational chatbot or any of those types of examples, right? So similar inputs to deep learning, but obviously very different outputs. And so what we've seen and what you've heard about at the keynotes this morning, and for those of you that were here yesterday, is that there's all sorts of opportunities that this is really unlocking for businesses. From new experiences, huge amount of productivity gains, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here as well. Insights that we haven't been able to gather before because we've been able to create many, many more of these connections and then use it to generate new outcomes. And then it's unlocking a whole lot of creativity as well in different people and different teams. So let's talk about the different ways to use generative AI. Some of those methods are more costly and some of them are cheaper and far more accessible, and that's part of what has driven this explosion of use and interest and excitement and hype and skepticism over the last couple of years. So let's start with creating your own foundational model. So not many people in the room will probably go down this path, right? Because it's hugely expensive, hugely complex. You need a certain amount of skill sets, but it is incredibly powerful in tailoring a foundational model to your specific need. So if you have that availability of that skill set and that experience, then it's a really good option to do because you get to control and make the model specific to your purpose and specific to your proprietary information. But some of you might create your own foundational models. A cheaper way to leverage the benefit of those foundational models is what we call fine-tuning, where you take those foundational models and you tune it to your organization, to your data as your differentiator. And so being able to train that model based on your data is really important, right? Because you get the domain knowledge and you get the benefit of the IP in your world. And it doesn't require as much investment as creating your own model in the first place. But it does require ongoing maintenance and a certain level of skill set. Many of you would have heard of the term RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. So it's another technique, it's cheaper, it's easier. You are able to use knowledge bases and curated information to be able to retrieve specific questions and specific goals that you're trying to achieve, and use the foundational models to then tailor the output and use the generation side of the foundational models. So you're using your own proprietary information to really get specific and tailored on what you're asking, and using the foundational models to then create the outputs. And then at the top of the stack, we've got prompt engineering. And this is where many of you probably have used some of the capabilities that have been made available over the last 12 to 18 months. Show me an image of, or create an image of, or tell me a text, or summarize this type of text. So your ability to ask specific questions and get the benefit of what those large language models and foundational models give you. So much cheaper, but there is an art in asking the right questions, right? Being able to get the types of outcomes, there's a bit of a learning on how do you tailor your prompts, but it's far more accessible than the layers below. So there are exciting times in the application and use of generative AI, but similarly there's been exciting times in the use of many different technology evolutions over the past, right? And so what do we take out of those lessons, out of those past experiences, and how do we apply that for our people and our teams today? With generative AI, there's all sorts of opportunities, there's all sorts of lessons, there's all sorts of events that lead up to these types of events, and we want to make sure that we're looking at those, understanding those, so that in order we can best use the capability for our people and our teams. So we're going to go back in history a little bit to do that. So cast your mind back, a little bit of a history lesson, but hopefully you take some really interesting insights out of this and think about how do you apply that in your organization. I told you we were going to go back in time, right? This is before I was even born. In 1436, the advent of the printing press, so Gutenberg's printing press, right? Fundamental point in history where all of a sudden the ability to disseminate information in ways they hadn't been able to before. Really unbelievable if you think about what they had to do before and who they had to rely on to create that sort of content and create those things. So it took that limited skill set and that limited power base, and it made it ubiquitous and available to all. A few hundred years later, so it's a pretty big leap, I know, but we had the advent of electricity and the electric light bulb, okay? And that seems hard for us to imagine what that meant at the time, but it's a really important point in time. And then, a century later, we had the same power and the same electricity that powering our personal computers, right? And then only a couple of decades later, we had the advent of the internet. And so similar to the printing press, a way to share information, to disseminate knowledge in ways that, again, we hadn't been able to in the past. And then, of course, the advent of cloud with AWS in 2006 meant that really sophisticated technology and capability and the ability to store information became accessible to everyone around the globe. That enabled the invention of many, many other things like social media and digital banks and e-commerce and all sorts of other things, right? And you'll see over time that the key points I've pulled out here, the gap between each of them gets smaller and smaller. So we're going to go through 6 lessons from those types of examples and think about, well, what were the key events leading up to that, and then what were the things that made them successful. Our first lesson is that those that succeed use the right tools. Really easy to say, really difficult to do when these tools are met with so much skepticism and hype, right? And so we know videos went online. I'm sure some people in the room remember going to your Video Easies and your Blockbusters and what you wanted wasn't there and waiting and seeing if someone would come back and put it on the counter and then grabbing that, go, yes, I've got it, and then keeping it for longer than you should have because you want to watch it again and again. How that world has changed. Similarly, cameras went from analog to digital and they're in your pockets, far more advanced than what we used to carry around, those big cumbersome cameras. Cars are going from combustion, obviously, to electric. So different companies saw the opportunity here, right? Either to disintermediate other industries or to really take those capabilities and help boost their own organizations. So the right tool to solve the right problem, even though some of those problems aren't necessarily understood. Our second lesson, and this is really important, and I can't sort of emphasize this enough, but a strong foundation is required. And that's really easy to say, and it's really hard to do when you have that hype about everything that's coming, right? How do you garner that hype, but also build those building blocks and those capabilities to allow you to scale? In 1879, Thomas Edison lit up a street just outside his Menlo Park workshop as a bit of a novelty. How exciting, I'm going to light up the street. But really to demonstrate what was possible. But then to turn that into how do I light up the streets of New York, you need those foundations, right? You need those power plants. You need the ability to do that in a really safe, robust way. And we call some of those technologies, as they evolve, general purpose technologies, right? They become ubiquitous, they become more efficient, more cost effective over time. But also they create the ability, or allow the ability for other inventions to come to life. Our third lesson is that there will be skepticism and hype. I think we know that, right? Particularly now, we know that there's skepticism and there's hype, and you need to be able to deal with both. Change is often threatening as well, right? So what does this new technology mean for me? This picture in the background here is the Council of Trent, which was in the 15th and 16th centuries. Called the Council of Trent because it was done in Trentino in Italy. I think they were going to do it in Bologna at one stage as well, so it could have been the Council of Bolognese. And that's not quite right. I'm not a history expert, but I've got a very poor sense of humour. So the Council of Trent, why this is important is because as the advent of the printing press came up, and Gutenberg reproduced the Bible, they were really worried about that dissemination of power. Why? Because it takes power away from those few who had the education and the ability to write books. And so to the church, that was a threatening perspective. And so they debated about whether they should clamp down on the ability to use the printing press, right? It's hard for us to understand that now, but it's a really interesting observation. So change is threatening, and there's skepticism and there's hype, but also experts can be wrong. And this was Wozniak saying, oh, it's a bit of a fad, right? Who needs a computer in their home? Probably something he'd want to sort of look back on and maybe think about again. Similarly, if you look at a book company based out of Seattle, why on earth are they offering cloud storage or compute services? Again, misunderstood, right? Amazon's risky bet, misunderstood at the time. Our fourth lesson is that new skills enable work to be reimagined. So as we've seen particular tech revolutions over time, whether it be the agricultural revolution, industrial, computing, remote working, that this has created new roles and new skills, but also forced us to rethink how we do work. We know it's created new types of roles. So my role, remember I said I was a data strategist, a principal data strategist? I'm pretty sure that role didn't exist 20 years ago, right? I don't know how many or what roles are in the audience, but I suspect a lot of your roles didn't exist 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And that's a short time frame if you think about, we're talking about the 15th century and some of how those evolutions have changed, right? Cloud architects, social media managers, sustainability managers, developer evangelists, all those roles are relatively new in our time frame, right? And so New technology, new evolutions, create new skills, create new roles, create new expectations. And that is threatening to us as people, right? But it also forces us to think about how should we rethink our work. So this picture is the assembly line at Ford. And so the advent of steam power and electricity and electric lighting enabled some of those assembly plants. And therefore, they rethought how they did the work. So the work comes to the worker, which enables much more efficiency, longer working hours, a whole different way to think about the work. And it means that there's new ways to think about how we engage our customers as well. So the advent of the internet, the advent of obviously your phones in your pockets means that you can do telemedicine, right? A whole new way to think about how you engage your customers and do your work. Those changes require persistence. They require confidence, they require proof points. And so that persistence pays off when it starts to be adopted. Our fifth lesson is that change brings new risks and new responsibilities. Never has that been more real than now, right? And so if you think about the internet and the explosion of customer data and sharing that customer data and then malware and then ransomware and all of these things that we didn't really know about when the internet was really first brought to life, how the privacy legislation catches up with that, right? But it's a lagging indicator. So the technology is adopted and used and organizations then want to use it, but the legislation lags. So there's lots of lessons in that for us with generative AI, and we're actually, you see it in some headlines at the moment, right? So how are you thinking about your customer data and the protection of that data and the use of that data, rather than just a black box, the use of that data and how we get there. And there's a law we call Martech's law that we've seen, right? So the technology comes first, it's adopted by individuals, it's adopted by businesses, but lagging is that public policy and that regulation. And so that's really worth thinking about, particularly with the advent of Gen AI, because we don't want to set ourselves up to be in an adverse position or put our customers in an adverse position. So how are we thinking about that sort of stuff early, right? How do we make sure that we've got that front and center now rather than when policy catches up? Our sixth lesson from history, our sixth and final lesson, before we then start to think about how we apply them, is value from these new ideas explodes. Case in point, Amazon in 1995 kind of looked like this. A simple way of ordering a book online is now a global marketplace connecting millions of customers with millions of sellers and providing all sorts of machine learning and AI capabilities, right? Including Alexa, including the Just Walk Out stores. Lots of press around that recently. So the sophistication and the use of computer vision and machine learning and AI to provide these new experiences is really amazing. My daughter she's just turned 17, works at Marvel in Melbourne in front of the Just Walk Out store. And so her role there isn't about the cashier and all that sort of stuff, because it's a very different customer experience. It's about how do you educate someone to walk in there, tap your credit card and have a bit of trust and faith and belief that we're going to charge you for what you're picking up off the shelves. And so as a 17-year-old, it's really interesting hearing her talk about that. For her, it's like, oh yeah, no worry about it. You don't need to do this. You just need to go in and do this, 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 and this. But she's talking to people of different generations who aren't as comfortable about sharing that data and don't have as much trust in, and whether it's granted trust, but trust in the cameras and in the machines, right? And so it's really interesting hearing her stories as she comes back from, a football game or a concert or a motocross and the different people she sees at the different events. But hearing her stories and hearing what takes up her time in that. So there are 6 lessons from history, and we've jumped around a few history lessons there, but interesting lessons because of each technical evolution and revolution, there are those key indicators and those seeds that have happened beforehand, right? It's not just what happens at the end of it, just the release of a new model or a new tool. So for us as leaders, and that's why you're here, you're a leader for your organization, for your customers, for your people, for your industry. How do we take some lessons out of this and how do we apply it to where we're at with generative AI today? So let's go back through those 6 lessons and just think about what it means. I really want you to think about what this means for you in your role now. Not just, there's a few nice PowerPoint slides, but what of these lessons are you doing? Are you doing well? Or should you be picking up and thinking about? All right, so let's start with those that succeed use the right tools. Now, it's probably no surprise that we think that Bedrock is a great tool, right? It's the right tool for the right job, not because of what it is, but for what it provides. It provides access to many different models and many different capabilities, and importantly, in a safe and secure way, right? So the right tool for the right job. The right model for the right job, the right outcome, not just a ubiquitous model that's going to serve everyone, right? And so we enable access to best-in-class models from our partners as well as our own proprietary models, but in a safe and secure way. So it's not just about the model and the sophistication and the accuracy of the model, it's how do you use that in the right way, in a secure and safe way. I think we've probably all seen, with the hype and a little bit of the skepticism of Gen AI, particularly over the last 12 months, we've seen examples where people jumping earlier are wanting to use some of those publicly available models and therefore using their data, their proprietary data or their customers' data in the use of that model, which is great because they get their outcomes, but also they're training the model for their competitors to get the benefits of that outcome as well, right? And so there's headlines all across the world about those type of examples. So we want to make sure we're using the right tools for the right job and we're using them in the right way. And that's where Bedrock is so different, right? Because it keeps it within your safe and secure cloud, and you're bringing the model to the data. You're not putting your data out to the model, you're bringing the model to your data. That's a really key distinction. Like I said, a strong foundation is required, and I think that's one of the hardest things to get right when there is so much hype. I've made mistakes in the past in some of my roles around getting too absorbed in the art of the possible without investing in the benefits underneath, right? So part of that is accelerating your cloud journey. Cloud enables so much, right? And we're seeing that those customers that are able to leverage this new capability as it comes online have done that heavy lifting and have their foundations in a great place so that they can quickly innovate and experiment and drive new propositions and new experiences and new outcomes. So if you haven't, you probably have, right, because you're here, but if you haven't accelerated your cloud journey, then start it now. Start with principles and start with foundational models and capabilities and elements. Train your people, get hands-on, leverage the expertise of your partners, move workloads because you're going to learn as soon as you're doing that, right? And the more you're learning and adapting and growing and developing your foundational capability, the more you're then able to leverage what we know is generative AI now, but what's coming in 12 months' time and in 24 months' time, right? And as the gap reduces between those innovations, you need to be in a really good place with your foundation to get that right. Like I said, it's sometimes really easy to get swept up in that hype and that outcome and that tool or using that model or that version of it. But you don't want to end up in a land of proof of concepts without being able to productionize and really get the value and the scale of the capability, right? And so that foundation is so critical. And it's not just your technical foundation, or of course that's important, but it's the mindset of your people. It's being customer obsessed with the outcome, not the solution. It's about the skills and the roles that you're investing in your people, right? It's about your processes and your ethics and your risks and your governance around that. And of course it's about your technology foundation as right. But you need all of those things in a really good shape to be able to leverage what's coming next and what's coming next. As opposed to just being able to do a proof of concept for the sake of doing a proof of concept, but never being able to then turn that into something that's productionized, something that scales, and something that's sustainably delivering value for your organization. So get your data foundation right. Did it come across that I'm passionate about that? I think it might have. Our third lesson is around how you address the skepticism and the hype, right? And it's always going to be there with some of these evolutions. So how do you think about that with your people? And how do we as leaders take them through that story? Because you want your people to be comfortable. Not too comfortable, but comfortable, right? Comfortable in the experimental mindset and adopting these new techniques and these new capabilities in the right way. And so it's going to have a profound impact on our roles and our people. And if you look at stats like this, you can be completely and utterly frightened by that and worried by that, or you can go, wow, what an opportunity. But it does require new skills. And some people are really open to that and some people aren't. So how do you talk about that, or how do you deal with that in your organization? So you will have people in your organization. When I say early adopters, you'll have someone pop into your head, go, oh yeah, actually it's me, that's why I'm here. Or I know people in my organization who are those early adopters. Who are those people who really like to experiment, who really like to get their hands on these new tools and these new techniques and test and learn? And you want to recognize them, right? You want to give them confidence that we love that for our organization. It brings value to our organization. So how do you grow and nurture those types of people? And that's different to the early majority of people who are a little bit tentative to start with, but need the confidence and need your trust and your guidance and your leadership that actually, no, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to take on, this is how we're going to change our organization, and this is how we're going to use some of those capabilities. And so they're the people that once they understand this is real, then they're on board and they'll drive huge amounts of change. But also, there's that late majority, right? These are the people who are a little bit more worried that actually their role is going to be impacted, and what does it mean for them? Maybe I become redundant in this capability, right? It's going to replace my role. So you need to deal with those types of groups of people really differently. You need to nurture them, you need to invest in them even more so potentially than the early adopters. The early adopters, maybe it's about reining them in and make sure they're doing it in a safe and secure way, but your late majority about how do you nurture, coach, and help them understand what's in it for them, most importantly. What's in it for them, what's in it for the organization, what's in it for your customers. So different ways to treat different people in your organization. We've talked about the skepticism, and we've talked about the hype, and we've talked about if you don't have your foundations right, then you're living in a land of proof of concepts. But that's not going to last for too long, right? So we've seen the explosion of proof of concepts, more than triple over a 6-month period from March to October last year, but the amount of proof of concepts that went into production hasn't increased at the same rate, right? And so those that have their foundations right are able to productionize and leverage this capability for sustainable scale. But if you haven't, then you're going to live in that land of proof of concepts, which brings me to my next point, which is really around the skepticism and hype. So this is the Gartner hype cycle. Many of you would be familiar with. And if you're stuck up in that land of POCs galore, then how do you smooth that curve so you're not in the deep, dark trough of disillusionment, but you're more towards the plateau of productivity, right? So how do you make sure that you're investing in your foundations as well as your proof of concepts, as well as your value, so that you smooth that curve out? You're not going into the deep, dark trough of disillusionment. Easier said than done. And so to do that, you want to make sure you're creating a bought-in team. You want to be clear on why you're doing this. You want to be really clear on how you're going to do it. And you want them to understand both what's in it for them, what's in it for their customers, what's in it for your organization. Not just, this is why, because it's going to create these great metrics for our organization, but what's in it for them? So what are they learning from this, and how are they growing as they're doing this? It's a really obvious statement. Fall in love with the problem, not the solution. But then when you're swept up in that hype that we talk about, it's really easy to then go, ooh, I want to use this thing. How do I find something to fix? Where's the nail I can hit with this hammer? So fall in love with the problem, not the solution. I'm sure none of you have ever seen this. It wouldn't happen in your organization, right? So think about what are the problems you're solving and what's the right way to solve that, not just using Gen AI for the sake of using Gen AI. And if that's the way to solve the problem, then great, but don't just have that hammer looking for a nail to hit, right? Think about how you're solving those problems. Ask the right questions. Is there a better way to solve it with more traditional techniques? In many cases there is. But don't be that hammer in search of a nail. So at Amazon, we've got a few techniques that we use to do this, right? To make sure we're not falling in love with the solution, right? We're trying to solve the problems. We use press releases and frequently asked questions. Some of you would be familiar with that. We use working backwards methodologies to really focus on what's the important thing we're trying to solve, right? And in some of those working backwards processes and some of those documents, we spend hundreds and hundreds of iterations getting that right. So we're really focused on what the outcome is that we're trying to solve, and working backwards from that outcome through what it means for everything else. It's a really good way to encourage the experimentation, but the thought evolution as you're going through it, right? It allows you to think outside the box, but then get really pragmatic about how you solve these things. Our fourth lesson is the skills, new skills enable work to be reimagined. So you're here for a reason. I think you're here because you know that there's capability here. And so if you're not training yourself and not training your teams, then start it now. Doesn't mean you're going to get it right first time, but you want to invest in your people. We think a lot of our organizations and a lot of the customers we work with have the people they need, but not necessarily the skills. So if you can train your people and not have to go out and hire these skills, and we know that those skills are scarce and rare and hard to find and hard to attract, let alone retain, so invest in your people. Start training your teams and training them now. And your success really depends on those people, right? Have you got the right people? Have you got the people who can use this capability? Or are you going to have to hire that in? How are you going to compete in the market to hire that in? So train your people incrementally and persistently. Train your people. And that also means looking at the skills that you have in your organization. And are they the right skills that you're going to need in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time, let alone in 18 months' time? And so do that stock take of those skills and have a think about what are the skills you're going to need as you start to change your propositions using some of this capability. What does that workforce look like? And how are you investing in that now? Not just in 18 months' time when we really need it, right? How are you investing in your people early? And some of those skills are machine learning skills, cloud and engineering skills, all sorts of domain knowledge skills, but also the critical thinking, problem-solving skills, right? Those soft skills as well. They become even more important. Like I said, we think most organizations have the people they need, but not necessarily the skills, right? And so we can help in all sorts of different ways. And if you're not leveraging your relationship with your account manager to bring a lot of this capability, then give them a hard time and get them to bring deep racer type opportunities to the table. Cloud era courses, certifications, machine learning universities. We have a wealth of ways to help and support our people through this, right? Our customers through this. I think it's really interesting if you think about those examples and tech revolutions that I've talked about in the past, how they've changed how organizations set up, right? Assembly lines, electricity, all those sort of things. But how many of our business models have changed in the last 100 years or 150 years? Are we still organized by particular silos because that's what it meant at the time, right? So have a think about, with the advent of this new capability and this new technology, how should you be doing your work? Not just in a structure that was put there in 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but what's the right way to address that problem now? How do you rethink how you do your work based on these new technology and skill sets? It's not just automating what you have today, right? In some cases, yes, it absolutely is about automating what you have today, but don't just get stuck in the trap of automating something that actually shouldn't be automated. Where's the value in that process? Is that process right, or do you need to change the process? Can you get value from doing that another way? Is it still necessary? Is it optimal? Redesign that work. What can people do best, and what can the machines and AI do best? And how do you optimize that? So an example that you may have heard about in some of the discussions over the last couple of days is Lonely Planet, right? So a vast history of data in travel and in itineraries, and they've reduced the cost to create those itineraries, specific and tailored to their customers, by using some of the Claude models that are available, right? Their history of information trained with those models to reduce the cost to create those itineraries, really specified and tailored and personalized to you. A really good way of rethinking the work. Another example out of Auckland is Clearhead. It was mentioned in the keynote yesterday, actually. A great way of looking at how they improve the context and the interaction based on previous interactions in their chats with their customers, but also being able to connect the right type of customer with the right therapist and getting really, really fine-grained and specific about how do you make sure that you get that match right. And it's solving a great cause, right? Mental health. What could be more important to solve? I think this is a really interesting quote. Language is the highest form of intelligence. So from the 40s through to now, the language we're using to interact with these capabilities is changing, right? So from machine language, MIPS, I studied that in university, right? Crazy. I didn't go to university in the 40s and 50s, by the way. may look it, but so how has that changed? So how have they moved or abstracted that technical complexity away from the microprocessor to what we do today, right? So assembly languages, Fortrans and COBOLs, C in the 70s and 80s, and C++, so object-oriented programming languages in the 80s and 90s, and then the fourth generation of those types of languages, Perl and Python, etc., into now what we call natural language, right? So how has that changed over time? Well, now natural language is a way that we can interact with these capabilities. It's a really different way to think about that evolution, particularly for the citizen developer, right? And Code Whisperer is a great example, and Q, you would have seen some examples about this, right? How do we generate code suggestions in real time to really increase the productivity and the capability of our highly paid, highly sought after, but scarce skills and resources? And it's starting to change the productive time of those highly paid, scarce resources, right? From less than a third of their time on value-added work, delivering value for organizations, because they're stuck in meetings and stuck in waiting for other people and stuck in testing or antiquated testing techniques and looking for coding examples on all sorts of forums and all sorts of webs, to now we want to increase their value, increase the time that they're spending on value-added work for your organization. So it's not just the code whisperers and just those augmentations, but it's also the operating models. Again, rethinking your work, rethinking how that work gets done. So you want to reduce the waiting time, the meetings. Developers love meetings, right? Right? No. They hate meetings. So how do you change your operating model as well as leverage some of this Gen AI capability to really increase their productivity and the value they're adding to their organization? And for me, I like this concept, right, of inverting the triangle, where in the past you've had your few precious resources working on high value creative work and so much more of your organization working on what we call the undifferentiated heavy lifting. And we know that you can automate and you can use the tools that are available to you today to remove that undifferentiated heavy lifting so that more of your people are working on the higher value activities for your organization. So invert that triangle. I know you can sometimes be overawed with stats and maybe you get a bit of banner blindness around stats, right? But these are just some examples around the uplift we see in some of our customers, some of our partners using things like Code Whisperer. And so Accenture, Co-Industries, SmugMug, massive uplift in speed to do the work, but it's not just speed, it's the quality, right? So the more likely, 27% more likely to be successful, right? That's a quality metric. These aren't things you should just gloss over. 57% increase in the time to do work. So if you have 10 developers, imagine if you had 16 developers instead of 10. Or imagine if you're getting 16 developers worth of productivity from your 10. Or 160 versus your 100. These are massive, massive numbers and changes to productivity, right? If you're not playing in this space, you need to. You need to increase the productivity of your key developers. So our fifth lesson is that change brings new risks and responsibilities. So if you haven't talked about or started your responsible AI journey, you really need to start. Remember that Martek's law, the curve, the policy, the lag that's coming, it's coming. It's just going to lag, right? So you need to be ahead of that curve, ahead of that wave, talking about things like biases, hallucinations, regulatory requirements, IP protection, accountability and transparency. You want to be talking about those now, not because a policy or a regulation has come out that says you have to. Because if that's where you land, then you're behind the game, right? So there's lots of aspects to a responsible AI program. And you need your organization to be on that journey now. Not just because you want to play with a Gen AI model, but because it's going to be really, really critical to how you set yourself up for success, future success, as the policy catches up, as the regulation catches up. And then our last lesson is that value from new ideas explodes. So Gen AI is set to radically transform companies across all industries, but also all facets of companies. And so the positive impact on our productivity and our creativeness is going to explode. So start. If you haven't started, start. Light your first street light. with generative AI now. Every role has the potential to be reinvented. Some of our titles won't exist in 2 years' time, right? They didn't exist 10 years ago, they're not going to exist in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So start lighting your first street light. So work backwards from your problem and your opportunities and solve those, right? Think about how you can solve those with some of the new technologies, but make sure you're really centered on solving the problem. Work backwards, define your use case, choose your models, choose the techniques you're going to be using to leverage those models, or develop your own model if that's where you're at. Iterate and continue to learn. Selecting the right project's really critical. So be driven by business value. Sounds really obvious. Sometimes we get lost in the hype and we're just doing something because that's what the cool kids are doing. So be driven by business value and those outcomes for your customers and for your people. And plan to grow. So it's not just about costs, it's not just about productivity, it's also about how you grow your organization, how do you grow your people, and make sure it has high impact, right? Like I said, the benefit of generative AI is across all industries and all different types of sectors. From engineering and product, to marketing and sales, to supply chain, to IT, to R&D, and obviously customer service, right? There's benefit across all of those different parts of your business, across all different types of industries. And like I said, value explodes. And it's not just in a particular industry. It's around healthcare and life science. It's around financial services, media and entertainment, education, manufacturing, automotive, software development, like we've talked about, and customer support, which are so many examples, right? How do you contextualize your chats to be relevant to that customer and their situation? There's opportunities across all of those different areas. And so let's just recap on those 6 lessons. And think about, as I go through these, think about how does this apply to you? Oh, no, I've got that in hand. Make sure you don't have the hubris to say, oh, I've got this covered, right? Have a think about what is relevant to you. Where do you want to spend your time and effort, right? So the first one is around those that succeed, use the right tools. So the right tools for the right job and obviously in the right way, so with the right approach. Our second lesson was a strong foundation is required. You don't want to end up in a land of proof of concepts without being able to leverage this for scale and for sustainable value. So accelerate your cloud journey, but get your data foundation right. Our third lesson was that there will be skepticism and hype, and you need to be able to address both of those things with your teams and with your people. So fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Our fourth lesson was that new skills enable work to be reimagined. Don't just automate what's there today, think about the work, rethink the work. Train your teams now and continue to train them. Our fifth lesson was that new technology brings, and new change brings new risks and responsibilities, so start your responsible AI program now if you haven't already. And our sixth lesson is that the value from new ideas explodes, so light your first street light now. The sooner you've started, the sooner you're learning, the more you're going to get value from this over time. Hopefully there's some nuggets of information for you in there and some really good things to apply into your situation, which might be right early starting out, or it might be, actually, no, we're trying and we're on this path, but we need to really think about these aspects and these capabilities. So hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully you'll go back to your teams and talk about the printing press. Maybe not. But think about those events that lead up to these really big inventions, right? What are those common things that we need to get right? Because generative AI is here and it's changing industries already, right? And so how are you thinking about that for your organization? So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. It's been a privilege to talk to you about this sort of stuff. Please, if you get a chance, rate this session. I'd love to hear your feedback and hopefully you take away some of those 6 lessons. Thank you, Cassidy.
Great session.